Ray Evans is a history professor. His interests are pretty broad. He's written a history of Queensland, no less. But for our purposes tonight, we're going to confine him to the war. And he's written a remarkable book entitled Loyalty and Disloyalty, Social Conflict on the Queensland Homefront. And we're talking about the Homefront tonight. Queensland's, as usual, in history, has been a bit of a tearaway on issues, thinking of federation myself, and the war was no exception, war conscription especially. If it wasn't for Queensland, we'd have probably had conscription, and only 15 years or so before, we nearly didn't have federation because of Queensland, so there's plenty to be proud of, really, as a Queenslander. But we'll come to all that soon. Just to be a brief recap, our support for the mother country meant Australia went to war when England did. You know, we're talking about obviously 100 years ago. In August 1914, the Prime Minister Andrew Fisher pledged full support for Britain with a lot of enthusiasm, and within weeks Australians were fighting the Germans in New Guinea with a landing in September at Rabaul, which is of interest to me because I'm actually writing a book on Rabaul, but the Second World War. And then, of course, in April the following year, we landed in Gallipoli, and the horrors slowly hit home with massive casualties on the Western Front in 1916 and 1917. So that's the background. Ray, speaking of casualty rates, can you put the casualty rate into some sort of perspective? Because the raw numbers don't quite tell the story, do they? We're talking about a large percentage of the population fighting and being gassed, injured, killed and taken prisoner. And that obviously had a big effect on the soldiers, but also the people at home. How big an event was that?
Well, you know, if we can review some of the statistics, we've got about 4.5 million people in Australia at the time. There's about 1 million able-bodied men in the right age demographic. 420,000 of those people, of those men, enlist, 332,000 fight, around 62,000 are killed, 155,000 are injured, and many hundreds of thousands more become ill and diseased because of the war experience. Actually, when you put the whole Australian casualty list together, 332,000 fight, but there are 616,000 casualties if you put in the diseases and the terrible diseases that people caught, that men caught at the Western Front. 616,000.
So everybody was a casualty in effect,
in
several
some way
times
or other,
over.
even if they weren't a physical casualty.
And their families too.
Yeah,
and their families, of course.
Yes,
and we forget about that, how terrible an effect the war had on people at home. And it's not just the people who were casualties of the war, but which were personal disasters, but you've got the family disasters at home.
Sure.
Can you describe how big an effect that was on society at the time? Because society wasn't quite as robust or unified as we'd like to think.
Well, you know, I mean, try and imagine. I mean, I was saying this the other day at another forum I was at. When we have a casualty today, or when we've had casualties in the Afghanistan war, you know, they're usually one or two at a time. The media makes a lot of fuss about the one soldier killed, but, you know, when you realise in one afternoon and evening at Fromell, in mid-1916, 5,532 Australians became casualties in a number of hours. You know, this is a small society trying to deal with this incredible impact of this horror. You know, and then when you go on with the Somme and the Ypres in 1917, you're getting 20 and 30,000 casualties in a couple of weeks or a few weeks for no real appreciable gain in territory. How does a society deal with it?
How did they deal with it? Because a lot of those casualties, I mean, the casualty numbers would have taken a while to trickle back here. A lot of the guys, I imagine, enlisted with their mates in special battalions of communities. So whole communities would have had many of their menfolk wiped out.
They're taking huge hits. And of course too, you know, of course there's a lot of grief and bereavement attached to this with individual families and sometimes losing several sons, not just one. one son, but also there was an imperative on people to not openly grieve, because that was seen to be, rather selfish. You had to be proud.
Or unpatriotic even.
Yeah, and unpatriotic, yeah.
So, the stoicism was encouraged, and that grieving was a private thing.
Yeah.
And I think, because the stuff that I do is about Anzac Day, but the idea of a minute's silence, the Italian thing would be to have a minute's wailing in the street, or about a couple of hours of it.
Right.
But we're British.
Yes.
And so we grieve in
definitely.
silence. That's a socially appropriate way. There's a kind of comportment around the grieving, and there's a discipline around it, and that's just the way the soldiers are dying bravely and they're not crying out in their wounds. That's the myth. Then we won't cry out. We'll just take this and we'll just try and move forward. So there's a very powerful kind of social pressure to do that.
Was that reinforced in newspaper articles or in stories?
Absolutely. I mean, it's in part what Anzac Day was about.
But see, along with their stoicism comes repression. You're repressing your real emotions, and they're going to come out in some way. And I think they come out in a lot of the tension and bitterness that occurs in Australian society during the war years, and the division that occurs, and the hatred of the local German population, for instance.
Well, so there was a lot of tension at the time, even before the war started. Can you describe some of the divisions that already existed in society?
Well, if we just look at Queensland, prior to World War I, we'd had a major general strike in Brisbane. I mean, people taking part in the strike said it was the first general strike in the world. General strike means everybody out, all the unions right across the union movement, 42 unions. 50,000 people lining the streets while another 30,000 unionists marched through the streets of Brisbane. It was a huge affair, and very, very divisive, and put down very hard by the state and so on. So that, there's a lot of industrial trouble preceding the war. And of course there are a lot of ethnic and racial tensions in the society, as we know, with all the different racial groups. Queensland had more of it had a wider range of ethnicities here and larger groups. We had the largest group of Germans in Queensland. We had the biggest group of Irish in Queensland. We had the biggest number of Aboriginal people, Melanesians, Asians and so on. So Queensland was a very multi-ethnic, multiracial kind of society, but not with the degree of tolerance we perhaps have today.
No, society was
extremely
divided by
racist
that, not
sort
united,
of society.
yes.
So it creates tensions in the society.
But there are also global trends that are happening in the period leading up to World War. There's the growth of first wave feminism. There's a growth towards a sort of secular, that fewer people are going to church than did in the later half of the 19th century. There's a lot of stuff around, concerns about temperance and about moral constraints around society. So these are broader dynamics which actually feed into what happens at the beginning of the war, because a lot of the clergymen and some of the educators, I feel they're vindicated. Okay, we can get this stuff sorted out now. The war's come. That's good, because it'll prove to people that we need to kind of, morally and spiritually rearm ourselves. So as well as the sorts of things that are happening in Queensland, there are broader cultural forces that society is trying to deal with.
So was there actually a sense that the war could unify society? Was society so divided at the time that the war was seen as something that could get people together?
It was certainly, it was presented as a source of kind of spiritual renewal, and what actually, the idea that the nation would then speak with one voice, which is ironic because, as Raymond points out, it degenerated into, a highly contested thing. But I still think for my stuff around the Anzac myth is it begins to be presented as something which will unite Australians. In their division, we will all share this legend. And I think in part it does that still.
So,
it might sort of quench the wound.
Yeah, it actually
Yeah.
talks about that. You know, I mean, I've read reports in, there's a Queensland magazine called Figaro, which was sort of popular.
Yeah.
And one of the things it says, well, look, can't we just forget about our divisions for today? Because it's Anzac Day. It's a day we can all share. We can all celebrate this or commemorate it, but this is the thing that we'll all share. So, you know, they're conscious of the divisions in society by 1917, 18.
Definitely.
And they're producing a kind of rhetoric which says, let's dispense with all this infighting and all band together, you know.
So were they seeking then, were they looking for a day? We already had Empire Day and Wattle Day and Queensland Day. All the states had their different
Many
days, and there
days.
would have been many days.
Yeah.
But there was something, was there something that was missing? Did we need, I think you mentioned too when we spoke earlier, we needed like a 4th of July for Australia.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very strong sense for me of reading through the literature and seeing contestation around these things. You know, the 26th of January was frankly, you know, there was the stigma of convictism. For us now, it's about an invasion, and that's an issue. But the taint of convictism, and South Australians in particular, they didn't want to know about 26th of January. They said it's got nothing to do with us, you know. So there's that happening. People produce Wattle Day, but it doesn't kind of have the gravitas that's really just about flowers and being nice, and which doesn't quite have the kind of thing that's going to grab people. Empire Day appears in 1900. Does anyone remember from school days ever having to commemorate Empire Day? Yeah, oh, there we go.
We were given a little card on the day with the Australian flag and the Union Jack on it with Empire Day and the year written underneath.
So Empire Day starts in 1905. So there's actually someone, and I read something in the Brisbane Courier at the end of 1913, and it says, well, we should forget about it. What we need is a solemn national festival. You know, some people think it might be St Patrick's Day or you know, whatever else. That's always going to be slightly problematic, you know, other than for about 25% of the population. So there's this idea that we need a Bastille Day, a 4th of July of some kind. So for me, in a sense, this 25 April 1915 is sort of prefigured a bit. You know, there are people talking about, and people fall upon it as the day which will bring us together.
So what made people do that? What happened then? And obviously, you know, the Anzacs went ashore. How was that reported at home, and what was the reaction to that made it resonate so well?
The major first bit of reportage came from an Englishman called Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, who was a journalist, and Bartlett was there observing the landing from a ship a couple of miles out to sea. He would have been dressed in his silk smoking jacket, probably sipping gin and tonic,
as journalists do.
and getting sort of reports secondhand from people as they came back to the ship. And so he's the authoritative figure who produces the stuff about the Australians galloping up the beach and charging up and bravely attacking the Turks, and then coming back and lying on the decks of the ships laughing with their wounds and that kind of stuff, you know. So that's problematic. Ashmead Bartlett actually does a tour of Queensland just around Anzac Day. He comes through here, but he's a tearaway by this time because he's condemning what's gone on in Gallipoli and thinks it's a disaster and makes himself very unpopular with the British High Command and also unpopular with the Australians. So they're censoring exactly what he's saying. He's a boozer and a womaniser, so he's just not the kind of person we really want to kind of reproduce the Anzac legend. So that's him. The other guy is probably more famous for Australians, which is C.W. Bean, and his writing's a little more tempered than what that Ashmead Bartlett has to say, but this stuff is produced in the Australian press in May, and people just go gaga over it. They get wonderfully excited. The incredible brave Australians, they've done it. You know, they were concerned about whether the Australians would be able to cut the mustard. You know, there'd been some reporting come back from Egypt about Australians misbehaving in Cairo and burning down brothels and that kind of stuff. And that wasn't the image they were trying to promote, really. And so what happens then is people sort of get really excited because this is the realisation of their dreams about Australian manhood.
Right, so it was going to take off anyway. It doesn't really matter what the facts were in some ways.
The facts had very little to do with it, you know.
But we'd been at war before. We'd had the Boer War, you know.
Well, the thing is, you know, one of the last times Australians had been in action in the Boer War, they'd made a complete and utter botch of it, and they'd been condemned as white lily-livered curs by the British, because it was the worst defeat of any colonial troops, and they'd
The
panicked.
Victorians, though, I think we should...
Wilman's Rust,
that makes sense.
yes, Victorians, yes, certainly, and so they had this hanging over them. You know, they had this shame hanging over them. So when they actually do succeed in the landing, there's an enormous sigh of relief goes up. And I read a report actually in the archives of a report coming through initially that they'd cut and run again at Gallipoli. That came through originally, a false report, of course, but it was like a sort of a re-echo of Wilman's Rust, you know.
So how quickly then was Anzac Day established as this significant day, Mark? I mean, could you think of those? You think of the dawn service and it's sort of semi-religious, but it's open to everybody. It's outside. It's not in a church. How did all that? Was that something that was preconceived?
Maybe preconceived isn't quite the word I'd use. What's interesting is that even before this newspaper reporting of the event happens in Australia, when they release casualty lists before this comes out. So Australians know that there's fighting that's gone on in Gallipoli. They don't know any of the details. Some might argue they still don't know any of the details even after the reporting comes out, but they don't know any of the details. But there's actually an event, there's an event in Perth commemorating the landing before we have all those sorts of details. So people are very keen to get some sort of commemoration around it. And by May of 1915, people are talking about this as the birth of the nation. There are countless letters of people writing in saying, this is our big national day, we should commemorate this day, we should make this a special anniversary, this should be a big event. And there are a number of things called Anzac Day happening prior to the first anniversary in 1916. So people are very fired up about the idea of something called Anzac Day. What that something is actually is not really set in stone in any sense, you know, by that stage.
Right.
So,
but there was a committee set up then to also organise what the day, what would be involved in the day. I mean, how did the dawn service evolve, for instance?
yeah, well, the dawn service actually came as a later addition. Though having said that, there are articles around when was the first dawn service. And so when you go digging into those things, inevitably you go, oh no, it's always hard to find the first one. Everyone else finds, oh, that was earlier than this, you know. But I did actually find a dawn service in Rockhampton in 1916. So I think it's probably on Anzac Day 1916. So it's probably hard to predate that. Though there was possibly a dawn service prior to that, who knows? But a major structure of the commemoration was produced by an organisation called the Anzac Day Commemoration Committee, which started in Queensland in early 1916, and it was a committee which grew out of the Queensland Recruiting Committee, and there was a public meeting in Brisbane in January 1916, and they set up this committee which produced a form of commemoration, which parts of which are still followed, and it was a committee which comprised significantly of clergymen. One of the driving forces behind it was a guy called Canon David Garland, who was an Anglican clergyman. So they are shaping a version of the commemoration. There are commemorations happening all over Australia. In part, some of the things are borrowing from what this committee is doing, but it's not universal. But they are shaping a form of commemoration in Queensland which becomes quite significant.
So there was a sense then of pride and you know, relief, I imagine. And after that, there would have been an enormous, and it would have been a huge boost to the expeditionary forces. But then, of course, things go badly when we withdraw from Gallipoli and we go to the Western Front. How quickly did things go downhill, and what was the reaction over time then to the people left at home after this, you know, relief and this enormous pride? You know, how did that slip away? Which I imagine it did.
Well, when you look at the recruitment figures, you know, there's a big peak just after the Gallipoli invasion, and there's another peak after we withdraw from Gallipoli. But then, as you say, it falls right down, and it never rises up again, right through to the end of the war. So the numbers of people actually enlisting, the number of men actually enlisting, is falling off from then, from about mid-1916. It's getting into really big difficulty. And you've got even from late 1915, the idea that we're going to introduce conscription, military conscription. And military conscription is really starting to divide the nation in a way that it's never been divided over an issue before. And of course, we have the two big conscription struggles in late 1916 and late 1917.
If you can maybe just describe them, because I imagine that the casualty rates were causing the military to go out looking for people, but they were also causing a lot of reticence for people to join up. So how was that handled? How did they actually promote the idea of conscription, and why did that fail?
Well, I mean, we lost about 26,000 casualties at Gallipoli. Then we lost 40,000 in 1916 and another 77,000 in 1917. So it's going up and up.
So
and
they're 1,000 a week.
Yeah, and they're trying to maintain an optimistic outlook about the war all the time in the face of all of these casualty lists. It's very, very difficult for them to do it, and they're starting to realise they're not going to get the volunteers even by these very heavy recruitment drives.
Enormous social pressure.
Yeah, incredible social pressure.
Well, it would be rare for an eligible man not to get a visit from the local recruiting sergeant. Many of them would have been visited 3 or 4 or 5 times. They recorded all the details. Well, there was enormous pressure. It was almost easier just to look. I'll just go to the army. All right, just leave me alone.
Yeah. Well, you're actually asked to fill out cards where you say, "I will agree to enlist now. If not, why not?
Yeah.
And when will you enlist?"
You just put coward on the card, but it didn't go down too well.
Right. And of course, there's certain imperatives about being a man. Masculinity is very heavily enforced, and to not want to fight is to say that you're not really a man. It's a difficult thing for men not to go.
Did many men... I imagine a lot of men at the time would have thought, as the nation probably thought, that it was a chance to prove their manhood. There would have been that...
Well, about 40% of men enlist.
40%.
And 60% don't, therefore, you see. So it's the male population is roughly divided between those that are prepared to go and fight and those that do not want to go.
But there are other factors, so that what actually happens quite a lot in rural families, for example, if you've got 3 or 4 boys, that they will make a decision that says, well, one son has to stay and work the land with me, your 2 brothers are going, but you're staying, so there are kind of economic decisions that are made around that process, and sometimes the one who stays feels he's missed out. But there are other sorts of reasons. It's not just... a lot of people who didn't go still supported the idea of the war.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that another thing that people are saying is that one of the reasons they won't go to fight is because they need to stay at home and defend their womenfolk from the Germans in the area, or what was the term that they used? The
enemy within? Or?
Yeah, that kind of stuff. Yeah. So there were a lot of anxieties too about what was happening locally.
Well, what happened to the Germans in the area? What was done with the large number of Germans, excuse me, who were living in Queensland?
Well, Ray's much more of an expert on this, so I'll defer to him on this.
Well, over the whole of Australia, about 7,000 Germans are interned, and they're usually the German males. Of the family. So the women folk and the usually large families of children are left behind trying to survive.
How were they interned? What were they?
Well, they were just rounded up and interned. There were no trials. I mean, a local person could put in a complaint against them that heard them saying something against the British in the pub or whatever. And sometimes it was because maybe they were after their land, because a lot of Germans lost their property.
There was sheer spite. We've talked about the letters that people would write in about, you need to come and arrest this man. There's local doctor in Cooktown has been there for 40 years who happened to have been born in Germany. And,
Oh, I know
you know,
the
the
guy,
kind of, you know, and sort of, and the police are actually upset about it. They say, no, I don't want to arrest him. You know, just leave us alone. But
Yes.
there's enormous amounts of. It's really ugly seeing all the dobbing
it is.
letters that go into archives.
And when you read some of the letters in the press too against the Germans, it just makes your blood run cold. I mean, the Courier, the Brisbane Courier runs column after column of these hate letters against the German population. You know, they lost all of their civil rights. But the interesting thing about Queensland is that although it had the largest number of Germans in Australia, they didn't intern the Germans to the same degree as other states did. Now, it's not quite clear why that happened. It may have been because the Germans were much more widely dispersed than they were in places like New South Wales, where they were, you know, concentrated in various in Sydney or whatever, and therefore they were more of an accessible target. But for some reason, Queensland had more people, you know, reporting to police than they actually sent off to the internment camps.
Were they called internment camps? I saw an article over there called a concentration camp.
Well, they were called concentration camps.
That's a bit ironic, isn't it?
Camp.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, well they were very
invented by the British, you know.
Yeah, that's right. From the Boer War.
It's the Germans who gave concentration camps a bad name.
Yeah,
Exactly. But the camps in Australia could be pretty brutal, you know. And in fact, there's a book by Gerhard Fischer called Enemy Aliens, and he's got in that book he talks about a Red Cross investigation into both the camps in Germany and the camps in Australia, and the camps in Australia were worse than the camps in Germany.
Right.
Okay, so I mean, it was a harsh process for the local Germans, and then of course after the war, most of them got deported back to war-torn Europe on 9 ships.
What's interesting about the demonisation of the Germans, one of the things interesting about it for me is that that's quite a sharp shift, because really up until early 1914 in Australia, Germans were seen to be good, you know, good citizens, the kind of migrants. They were white, they were Protestant, they were the ideal hard-working
rural people.
Yeah, rural people, and there's quite a radical turnabout to all of a sudden demonise them, and they're
in a few weeks.
Yeah, in a matter of weeks, and there's enormous respect for German culture, and Germans have the German education system is seen as something to be desired, and as a musician there was a lot of Germans involved in music. In fact, there's one sort of interesting story about the process in London where in a gesture of great loyalty to the empire, what they decided to do was in the symphonic program for the year of 1916, the symphony orchestras refused to play any music which is written by Germans or German-speaking. So no symphonies by, you know, Beethoven, you know, Mendelssohn, Brahms. The list goes on and on. And the newspapers applauded this gesture, and they thought it was a wonderful patriotic thing to do, except no bugger actually went to the concerts, you know, when they were, because all the good music was gone, you know. So people were actually smashing their German-made pianos and that kind of stuff in Australia. And it was quite extreme, and it was quite a turnaround, you know, for the Germans themselves, who'd been seen as people who were you know, quite, you know, typically good citizens.
Yeah,
and
they became very quickly the bestial Hun, you know, who would do anything.
Yes.
Really poison the water supplies, put poisonous bacteria in the food,
It's
whatever.
disturbing we can change our attitudes
very quickly.
so quickly.
Very quickly. And it's part of the process of mobilising people for warfare, because you see, you've got to get them to hate people they don't even know in order to go off and kill them.
And if they're living next to them and they know they're really nice, it's quite a problem.
Yes.
You know, so that's the kind of stuff that happens.
So we're getting into 1916-17 when people are getting war weary. A lot of the casualty lists are coming through. People aren't coming home. How did that affect families, though? I mentioned before these little family disasters that must have occurred when you've got perhaps 2 or 3 sons that have all been killed, maybe a husband. I mean, it's devastating, financially, emotionally.
Definitely, and it's, you know, it's hard to tell, isn't it? How much did it shake the loyalty of families that were British to the bootstraps, you know, and great believers in the British Empire and the righteousness of the British cause, to lose a couple of sons? and maybe even get a letter saying it was due to bungling, you know. That I was reading a case today about how a family lost 3 sons, and the 4th son had written a letter while these other ones were dying, saying, I believe they've been murdered by absolute military incompetence and ineptitude by the British authorities, you know. So I mean, how does that shake everything you believe in terms of the way the world works? You know?
How did society cope? I mean, are there any examples that you can think of about?
There's that very interesting book by Brian Lewis called Our War. He's a young boy during the war, and he writes this book later on in life, but he was from a very, very pucker, you know, upper middle class family in Victoria, believed totally in everything they were told about Great Britain and the British Empire, and they lose. Well, two of the sons come back shambling wrecks from the war, injured and gassed and mentally disturbed, and the third one is killed. Well, you know, the impact of the 3 of them just changes that family. It changes all their values, and the boy himself is at school. He's at a private school, and they read out with great pride, you know, the growing war list of the old boys. But when they read out his brother, you know, he can't even stay in the room. And he says it's just, you know, there's no pride in this. We were turning against the war. We hated it.
There were people, I mean, I don't doubt for me that some people were consoled by that simple imperial, you know, kind of rhetoric that says, your son, husband, brother, father died as an empire hero. I'm sure that would have reassured some people.
Sure.
They're looking for a kind of meaning in this horror, and that would have given them some meaning to have that death celebrated in some way.
You've got to cling to it for your own sanity, really.
But there are some very powerful stories, and the one that resonates with me is one that came in a book written by Jay Winter, where he talks about a girl who, in 1918, there was a ceremony, I think it might have been an Anzac Day ceremony, where she was a school student and she was told to salute the flag as the flag was raised, and she refused in the school. And the teachers asked her why she refused to salute the flag, and she said because her father had died as a result of that flag, and she couldn't honour that flag because for her it just meant, and this is a kid of 12, gutsy, a kid of 12 or whatever, just saying, you know, that she couldn't respect that because it had caused this trauma for her and this death in her family. So, you know, the teachers responded by caning her, but, you know, this was the kind of expectation that, you know, you have this traumatisation through society, but also through schools. You know, you can imagine how many kids who were being taught were coming from these horrific family situations. And in our day in a school, there'd be an enormous amount of pastoral work going around trying to help these kids cope with their grief, and so it should be. But in those days, there's nothing, corporal punishment. You know, if you're crying, you know, and so it's not just the trauma, but the way it's tried to, as Raymond says, the way it's sort of trying to be controlled and compressed within society, that things are going to give. There's going to be rupture in that situation.
Nobody is getting much help anywhere, really, you know, pastoral help or whatever. You know, if you get shell shock on the Western Front, it's because you're a coward. You're a weakling. It's not because the devastating technological impact of the war has just shattered your nerves totally. It takes ages for them to recognise this. But even when they medically recognised it, there was still that stigma that the ones that fell into shell shock were the weak men, you know.
You mentioned
neurasthenia had traditionally been diagnosed as a woman's disease.
Yeah.
You know, and so they had to switch that around. So hang on, there are all these men coming back with this woman's madness.
Yes.
They call it shell shock.
Well, hardly surprising. And you mentioned before too, Ray, a lot of the women who'd lost fiancés or husbands never married again. No. So there was that sort of tragedy as well.
So you've got that side of it, the widows, you know, who go on grieving. Then you've got families where the man does come back, but the man who comes back isn't the man who went away. And there's a huge peaking of domestic violence in Australia and trouble within the
right?
home
So
because
statistics
of these highly disturbed men coming back because of their war experiences. So they bring the war home, you know, they bring it into the domestic sphere for the women and children
And
to
they
deal
also
with.
bring back venereal disease.
Yeah.
And TB.
50,000 Anzacs come back with VD. 50,000 out of 300,000.
That's going to have an impact on the families. Yeah.
And there's no cure for it.
No.
So, you know, these are huge social... And then, of course, they bring back the Spanish flu too. You know, 1 million people in Australia catch the Spanish flu in 1919.
So how did society survive all of that?
It's
on so many levels. All these big and small tragedies, family, individual, social, community tragedies. How do we cope? I suppose we do. That's what we do as human beings.
They don't entirely fall apart, but it is, as Joan Beaumont calls her new book, a broken nation. You know, and that's the irony, you know, with what Mark is doing too, you know, talking about the binding force of Anzac, but it's trying to bind up a society that's never been so broken. You know, as a nation, it's not just a unifying story. It's every one of the people that have done histories on the different states during the war. Now we've got a history for every state except South Australia, and each one of us, I've done Queensland, but every state has been done, and every one of those historians has come to the same conclusion. The society was never more nationally divided, not united, divided in all sorts of ways. And of course, later on, the Anzac legend is used to bind up the wounds.
It must have been some comfort, though, at the time, the Anzac ceremony. There was that memorialisation would have been of some.
Yeah,
comfort.
I mean, I think the point that I made is that it was essentially, in some ways, a ceremony which was a kind of a formal funeral service, which was taken out of churches and made into a civic event because significant numbers of Australians were not churchgoers. I mean, large numbers of them were, but significant numbers weren't. And so I think there was a felt need for some sort of public acknowledgement and public mediation, around this grief, around this trauma, and in part, Anzac Day serves that function that people acknowledge it, and there's a sort of government acknowledgement of that, but just how pastoral that is questionable if you just present a certain mythology that says, be consoled by the fact that this man died a hero.
It may not be quite enough.
It might. I'm sure some people would be consoled by that, but I know how I'd feel if someone told me one of my sons had been killed in the war. It was okay, he died a hero. I'd be going, I'm sorry, it doesn't work for me. And I'm sure there are lots of people who are saying that too, you know.
And it's interesting, isn't it, Mark, in that account of the first Anzac Day in Brisbane, in the Daily Standard, I think it is, where they say that a lot of the people in the crowd, about 50,000 people actually, but a lot of the people were carrying cherished relics of those who lie sleeping at Gallipoli. And they probably had photographs with them, or what?
Yeah, they would have
items of
those sorts of things,
clothing,
those personal effects, which are kind of their own little shrines. And the irony of that is, of course, that the day is also being promoted as a major recruiting day. So you've got the situation where you've got these huge military marches, and people are saying, here are the war heroes are being paraded down the street, and you have to wonder about the ambiguity of saying, you could be like this, and seeing some person who's been entirely disfigured by the war. You kind of wonder about the logic of that as a recruiting exercise. And by the end of the war, the recruiting committees are saying, actually, Anzac Day is not working as a recruiting exercise. Let's go back to having the good-looking girls kissing guys and trying to encourage them into recruiting sorts of things, because that was actually actually much more successful.
And in that first Anzac March too, they're all cheering, and then these cars come along with the injured men.
There's a sense that people are shocked.
And they have to get the men out of the cars up onto the stand, and they have to carry them, and they've got no broken limbs or no limbs, and the crowd falls from cheering to total
Because
silence.
there's a certain image of the wounded, which is the brave soldier with the bandage across the top of his head, still firing his rifle, which didn't look anything like the reality of what those men were like when they came back.
Well, see, only 0.25% of the casualties at the Western Front were bayonet wound casualties. Most of the others were from missiles, and the missiles were shrapnel and so on, which leave great tearing wounds, in very ugly tearing wounds in human bodies. Facial wounds. You may have watched, Boardwalk Empire, and the character in that with half his face gone, and so on. And it's disfiguring, and it's ugly, and it's not the cherished image of the British are at war. It's the opposite. It's the absolute opposite.
We get to 1971 or 2 when Eric Bogle wrote That segues quite nicely.
Okay.
Now, Mark, you brought your guitar.
I did bring my guitar.
Have we got time for a quick song?
I've got time for a quick song. So what we'll do here is the thing which people should never do, which is to analyse a popular song for its historical accuracy. But I'll ask you to do that anyway. And we'll see how we go. I think Raymond knows more about this song than I do. He was telling me some stories about
I'm not sure, but Eric Bogle was living in Brisbane when he wrote this song, and he'd been to see the Anzac Day March. It was 1971, and he saw the old men, marching past or shuffling past, and he went home and he wrote this song, and it's become an international peace anthem, really.
Yeah, keep talking. You're doing.
And it's one of the great songs, the great anti-war songs of all time, I think.
Yeah.
It's very nice to think it's connected with Brisbane.
Yeah. So the song's called "The Band Played Waltzing With Joy." Anyone who's never heard the song or doesn't know it? Oh, that's good. So I want to get the lyrics wrong, you'll be able to just correct me. Okay, here it goes. Oh, when I was a young man, I carried me pack. I lived the free life of a rover. From the Murray's green basin to the dusty outback, I waltzed my Matilda all over. Till in 1915 the country said, son, it's time to stop rambling, there's work to be done. So they gave me a tin hat and they gave me a gun, and they sent me away to the war. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as the ship pulled away from the quay. Amid all the cheers, flag waving and tears, we sailed off of poor Gallipoli. Oh, how I remember that terrible day. A blood stained the sand and the water, and how in that hell that they call Suvla Bay, we see my old comrades, how proudly they march, renewing old dreams and past glories. I see the old men, tired, stiff and worn, forgotten heroes from a forgotten war. And the young people ask, what are they marching for? And I ask myself the same question. And the band plays a waltzing Matilda. The old men still answer the call. But year after year, the numbers get fewer. Someday no one will march there. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, you'll come on waltzing Matilda with me. And the ghosts may be heard as they march by the door. You'll come on waltzing Matilda
Right, well, there's...
Do we have time to quickly work out some of the things that are wrong with the
Yep.
song?
Well, how about we just...
Suvla Bay.
There's a few things. And 1971, I suppose, it was a forgotten war. We didn't have that regeneration, did we, that we have now? That
Kate and I have an in-joke about the forgotten Anzacs. Yeah. No, they're not forgotten.
no.
It was getting that way in 1971.
That's
though.
right.
It was, yeah. So it was the song which was time. I guess the key thing that I make about the song is that when they came back, they wouldn't have played Waltzing Matilda. No. What would they have played? What would have been played as the soldiers? God Save the King or
Soldiers
Land of
of the
Hope and
King.
Glory, Soldiers of the King?
Yeah.
Rule Britannia, you know, they went off to fight for the British Empire. So
They
to
used
play
to sing Australia Will Be There.
Australia
a
will be
lot.
there, they might have done that. But to play Waltzing Matilda would have been actually something which would have been quite transgressive, I think.
Yes.
The soldiers may have sung it themselves, but it wouldn't have been something that would have been played at a formal welcome home.
No,
you know?
no, I
So,
don't think
yeah,
so.
I mean, amongst other things, that's an interesting idea about the song. They were fighting for the British, part of the British Empire, you know, so...
Well, we could probably talk, and we could definitely talk about this for another couple of hours. But look, we're way out of time. We're over time. There's some pamphlets, some interesting artefacts over on the tables there for you to have a look at. And if you have any questions, Simon Farley is here. He knows all about it. But look, I'd like you to thank Mark Cryle and Ray Evans for coming along tonight and talking to us about this fascinating subject.